Everyone knows about Enigma. The name alone carries weight. The mystery, the genius, the idea that one machine could lock away an entire war inside an unbreakable code. You've seen it in movies, you've read about it in books, you might even think you know the whole story. But almost nobody actually knows what happened on the water. What happened when a small group of sailors, half frozen, half terrified, reached out and grabbed something they weren't supposed to grab. Something the Germans were so certain no enemy could ever touch that they built their entire military communications strategy around its supposed impossibility. And that one grab, that one desperate, chaotic, life-risking moment in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean changed the entire course of the Second World War, not slowly, not gradually, immediately, decisively, in ways that are still hard to fully comprehend even now 80 years later. If you want to understand how wars are really won, not just on the battlefield but in the shadows, in the basements, in the signals flying invisibly through the air, then stay with this. Because what you are about to hear is not the sanitized version. It is not the Hollywood version. It is the real story of how one captured machine broke open a code that was never supposed to be broken, and how that moment quietly ended the war faster than any bomb ever could. And if you want more stories like this, stories that dig below the surface, that find the moments history forgot to spotlight, hit subscribe right now. This is the kind of content we put out every single time. Let us start at the beginning, not with the capture, with the machine itself. Because before you can understand what was taken, you have to understand what Enigma actually was, what it did, and why the Germans were so completely, absolutely certain that nobody outside of their own ranks could ever crack it. Enigma was not a simple cipher tool. It was not a codebook or a substitution table that an enemy could stumble across and immediately read. It was an electromechanical encryption device that generated an almost incomprehensible number of possible settings. The machine looked at first glance like a slightly odd typewriter. It had a keyboard. It had a lamp board above the keyboard, a flat surface covered in small illuminated letters. And in the middle, it had a series of rotating wheels called rotors, typically 3, sometimes 4, that were connected through a complex system of wiring and a plug board at the front that added yet another layer of scrambling. Here is how it worked in its most basic form. A German operator would sit down, receive a message he needed to encrypt, and begin typing. When he pressed a key, the electrical signal would travel through the plug board, through the rotors, bounce off a reflector at the back, travel back through the rotors and plug board again, and then light up a completely different letter on the lamp board. The operator would write down whatever letter lit up. That was the encrypted character. The person receiving the message would set their own Enigma machine to the identical starting configuration and type in the encrypted text. Because of the reflector, the process worked in reverse and the original message would appear letter by letter on their lamp board. Simple to use, blindingly complex to crack without the proper settings. And here is what made it truly terrifying from a codebreaker's perspective. The rotors stepped forward with each key press, meaning the electrical pathway through the machine changed with every single letter. So pressing the letter A once might light up the letter Q, but press A again immediately after, and you might get the letter M. The same key never produced the same result twice in a row. This meant that standard frequency analysis, which had broken virtually every cipher in human history by looking at how often certain letters appeared in encrypted text, was almost entirely useless against Enigma. There was no pattern to find. Every letter's frequency was artificially flattened by the constant rotor movement. And that was before you even accounted for the plug board, which swapped pairs of letters before and after they went through the rotors, multiplying the possible combinations into a number so large it was effectively meaningless to try to calculate by hand. The Germans had worked out the mathematics. They knew the numbers. At any given time, accounting for rotor selection, rotor order, ring settings, plugboard connections, and daily key changes, the total number of possible Enigma configurations was somewhere in the neighborhood of 158 quintillion. That is a 1 followed by 20 zeros. Even if you could test one configuration every second, working through all of them would take longer than the age of the universe. The Germans were not boasting when they called Enigma unbreakable. They had done the math, and the math agreed with them, so they did something that in retrospect looks almost criminally overconfident. They built their entire war communication system on top of it. Every branch of the German military used Enigma: the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the SS, the Reich Security Main Office, the railway network. Every command, every order, every movement of troops and ships and aircraft was encrypted with Enigma and transmitted over radio. The assumption was absolute. Even if the enemy intercepts every single message we send, they will never, not in 1,000 years, be able to read a single word of it. That assumption was wrong. But proving it wrong nearly cost more lives than it saved, and the people who managed to prove it wrong had to work in conditions of such absolute secrecy that most of them went to their graves without ever being able to tell anyone what they had done. The story of Enigma and the people who fought to break it has many starting points depending on which thread you pull. The most famous thread runs through Bletchley Park, the British government's code-breaking establishment set up in a Victorian mansion about 50 miles north of London. This is where Alan Turing worked, where Gordon Welchman refined the bomb machine, where thousands of analysts, linguists, mathematicians, and crossword enthusiasts spent the war hunched over intercepts, looking for any tiny weakness in the machine they were trying to crack. And what they found slowly, painfully was this. The mathematics of Enigma might be essentially unbreakable on paper, but human beings were not mathematics. Human beings made mistakes, and those mistakes created vulnerabilities that Enigma's designers had never accounted for. The Germans had strict protocols for Enigma operation. Every day at midnight, the settings would change. Rotor selection, rotor order, ring settings, plugboard connections, all of it would reset to a new configuration listed in a key sheet distributed in advance. Operators on both ends of a communication would set their machines to that day's settings and could then communicate securely until midnight. The system relied on absolute discipline and absolute secrecy of the key sheets. And for the most part, that discipline was maintained, but not perfectly, not always. Operators under stress, under fire, under the pressure of real military operations sometimes took shortcuts. They sometimes used predictable message indicators. They sometimes opened weather reports with the same word every single time. They sometimes sent messages that began with standard, predictable phrases that the code breakers at Bletchley Park learned to recognize and exploit. These were called cribs, known or suspected sections of plaintext that could be lined up against the encrypted version to give the analysts a starting point. But even cribs only took you so far. Even with cribs, even with the brilliant logic of Turing's bomb machines chewing through possible rotor settings, there were still too many variables, too many unknowns. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park could sometimes break a day's settings before midnight, sometimes, on good days, with luck. But they could not do it consistently, and some settings resisted them entirely for days or weeks at a time. The Navy was the hardest problem, because the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was the most disciplined, the most careful, and the most operationally critical branch using Enigma. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war. German U-boats were hunting Allied shipping across the North Atlantic, sinking supply ships, fuel tankers, troop transports. Britain depended on those supply lines. Without them, the island would starve, freeze, and run out of the materials needed to fight a war. Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat campaign, and the U-boats were operating almost entirely on Enigma encrypted communications. The wolf pack tactics that made them so lethal, the coordinated attacks where 10 or 15 submarines would converge on a convoy simultaneously, depended on encrypted radio communication between U-boat command in Paris and the individual submarines at sea. If Bletchley Park could read those communications, they could route convoys away from the wolf packs. They could send destroyers to intercept submarines. They could save ships and the men aboard them. If they could not read them, the killing continued. And there was a particular version of the naval Enigma that was making Bletchley Park's lives even harder. The standard 3-rotor machine was already a nightmare. The naval version added a 4th rotor, taking the number of possible configurations from impossible to something that makes impossible look optimistic. The 4-rotor naval Enigma, which the Germans introduced in February of 1942 for their Atlantic U-boat fleet, went dark to the codebreakers almost immediately. Suddenly, months of hard-won analytical progress was erased. The Atlantic went silent in terms of intelligence, and the ships started going down again. By the middle of 1942, the Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping were being sunk every month. Crew members were dying in burning oil slicks or drowning in the freezing North Atlantic. Food rationing in Britain was getting worse. The flow of American war material, which the United States was now pouring into the Allied war effort after Pearl Harbor, was being intercepted and destroyed before it could arrive. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park were sending desperate requests up the chain of command. They needed physical materials. They needed actual Enigma machines, actual key sheets, any physical document that could help them reconstruct the settings they could not crack analytically. And the military planners who received those requests knew exactly where such materials might be found: German ships, German U-boats, German weather stations. Any operational German installation that used Enigma and might have key sheets, rotors, operating manuals, anything that could be physically retrieved. The problem was getting to them. A German warship is not an easy target to board. A U-boat underwater is utterly inaccessible, and any attempt to capture German cryptographic material had to be done without the Germans realizing it had been taken, because the moment they knew their documents were in enemy hands, they would change everything and all the intelligence advantage would evaporate instantly. This requirement for secrecy made the whole enterprise even more dangerous and even more difficult. You had to capture the material. You had to do it in circumstances where the Germans could not radio home to report the capture. And you had to do it fast enough that any survivors could be contained before they could warn anyone. These were not the conditions of a neat military operation. These were the conditions of improvised, desperate, terrifying chaos. And that chaos produced some of the most extraordinary stories of the entire war. The first significant breakthrough came not from a dramatic capture but from a tragic accident of war. In May of 1941, a German weather ship called München was intercepted by British forces in the Norwegian Sea. Weather ships were a crucial part of the German communication network because accurate weather data was essential for planning operations in the Atlantic. They were equipped with Enigma machines and carried current key sheets. The München was caught by surprise and her crew, following standard procedure, began throwing classified materials overboard and attempting to destroy the Enigma equipment before abandoning ship. But the British boarding party moved fast enough to retrieve materials that had not yet been destroyed. Among them were Enigma keys for June of 1941. This was an extraordinary find. Not the machine itself in complete form, but enough to give Bletchley Park a running start on the current settings. The analysts worked frantically. For a brief window they could read naval Enigma traffic almost in real time. It was for those weeks a revolution. Then the keys expired and the window closed, but the experience proved something crucial. These materials could be captured intact if the operation was planned correctly and executed fast enough. The race was on to do it again, and to do it better. Less than 2 weeks after the München incident, the Royal Navy got what it had been looking for. Not just documents, not just key sheets, the actual machine. The encounter that would become one of the most consequential naval actions of the entire war began with a routine convoy battle in the North Atlantic. On May 8, 1941, the German submarine U-110 was part of a Wolf Pack attack on convoy OB 318, a westbound convoy making its way across the Atlantic. The convoy had an escort group commanded by Captain Joe Baker Creswell aboard HMS Bulldog. Also present was HMS Aubrescia, a corvette, and HMS Broadway, another destroyer. The U-110, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp, had already made one attack on the convoy when the escorts counterattacked. Aubrescia picked up the submarine on sonar and dropped depth charges. The concussion blew U-110 to the surface, forcing her into the open, disabled, unable to dive. Lemp, realizing his boat was finished, ordered the crew to abandon ship and began the process of scuttling. Standard procedure for exactly this situation. Destroy the classified materials, destroy the Enigma, sink the boat before the enemy can board it. But something went wrong. Either the scuttling charges failed to detonate, or there was not enough time to set them properly, or the chaos of men abandoning a sinking submarine while under attack from enemy warships simply meant that the destruction procedures were not followed completely. U-110 sat on the surface, listing slightly waterlogged but afloat. Lemp, already in the water, reportedly tried to swim back to the submarine when he realized what had happened. He was not going to make it back. Some accounts suggest he simply disappeared beneath the waves. Whatever happened to him, U-110 did not sink. And on HMS Bulldog, Captain Baker Creswell saw an opportunity that almost certainly he had been briefed to watch for. He ordered a boarding party. Sub-Lieutenant David Bommy, just 20 years old, was put in charge of it. Bommy and his team rowed to the still-floating U-110 in a whaler and climbed aboard. What they found when they got inside was beyond anything they had reasonably hoped for. The submarine was in a state of organized abandonment, not panic destruction. The crew had left in a hurry, but the boat was largely intact. The Enigma machine was sitting at its operator's station, rotors in place, not destroyed, not thrown overboard, just sitting there. Alongside it were key sheets, operating documents, and a complete set of the materials that Bletchley Park had been desperately requesting. Bommy and his team began passing everything they could find up through the hatch and into the waiting whaler. It took over 2 hours. They had to work while U-110 groaned and shifted beneath them, uncertain whether the submarine might slide under the surface at any moment. Eventually, HMS Bulldog came alongside and a tow was attached. For a brief moment there was hope of bringing U-110 itself back to a British port, but she sank the following morning, taking with her any remaining materials and any evidence that she had been boarded at all. This last point was critical. The Germans assumed U-110 had gone down fighting. They had no reason to believe she had been boarded. Her crew, rescued by Baker Creswell's ships, were kept in strict isolation and told nothing. The British imposed a complete blackout on any information about the capture. The sailors who had taken part were sworn to secrecy under the Official Secrets Act. The Admiralty sent a message to all involved warning them in the starkest possible terms that what had happened must never be spoken of, never written about, never mentioned in any context for as long as the war lasted. The prize must remain secret, and it was, for decades. The materials from U-110 arrived at Bletchley Park, and the effect was immediate and dramatic. For the first time, the codebreakers had a complete functioning Enigma machine, along with current settings that allowed them to read actual naval Enigma traffic in something approaching real time. The four-rotor problem was still ahead of them, but what they gained from this capture allowed them to make enormous analytical progress on the naval settings. Convoys began to be routed more successfully. U-boats that had been operating with terrifying freedom began to find their targets harder to locate. The wolf packs struck into empty ocean more and more often because the ships they were hunting had already been told to go somewhere else. People died, ships still went down. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won in a single day, but the trajectory changed. The capture of U-110's Enigma equipment was, in the quiet, unglamorous language of intelligence history, a turning point. And it was not the last one. The need for naval Enigma material was continuous. Bletchley Park's analytical methods could sometimes work with what they had, but every new set of physical keys, every new document, every variation in Enigma configuration required fresh physical intelligence to help the analysts keep pace. The Germans periodically updated their procedures, added new complexities, changed their protocols. Each change threatened to plunge the Atlantic communications back into darkness. So the hunting for Enigma material never stopped. It became a systematic, carefully organized effort involving naval intelligence, operational commanders, and the boarding parties who actually had to go and get the material under fire. In September of 1941, another weather ship, the Lauenburg, was intercepted north of Iceland. Again, boarding parties moved in before the crew could complete their destruction procedures. Again, Enigma materials were recovered. Again, Bletchley Park received a gift that bought them weeks of operational intelligence. The procedure was becoming almost routine, though routine is a deeply inadequate word for operations that required men to board sinking or damaged enemy vessels while under fire, with no certainty that the vessel would not sink under them or that the crew might not resist. But even with all of this, the four-rotor problem remained. When the German Navy introduced the four-rotor Enigma machine for its Atlantic U-boat fleet in February 1942, it represented a catastrophic setback. The additional rotor multiplied the possible configurations by another factor of 26, and crucially, the existing bomb machines at Bletchley Park were not designed for four rotors. They could not break the new settings using the same methods that had worked on three-rotor traffic. The Atlantic went dark, not metaphorically, operationally dark. Bletchley Park could not read the U-boat signals, could not track the wolf packs, could not route the convoys, and the ships started dying again at a rate that threatened to strangle the Allied war effort entirely. Between February and October of 1942, the Allies lost over 3 million tons of shipping in the Atlantic alone. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men, cargoes of food, fuel, weapons, and vehicles that Britain and the Soviet Union desperately needed. It was the most dangerous period of the entire Atlantic campaign, and it was directly connected to the blackout on four-rotor naval Enigma. The pressure on Bletchley Park and on the naval intelligence community was immense. New bomb designs were being worked on, new analytical approaches were being explored. But what was really needed, what would shortcut all of that theoretical work, was physical material, a four-rotor machine, the settings books for the four-rotor configuration, anything that could give the analysts at Bletchley Park a foothold in the new system. And then came the moment. October 30, 1942, the North Atlantic northeast of port said, HMS Petard, a P-class destroyer, was part of the escort for a convoy when it picked up a submarine contact. The submarine was U-559, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans Heitmann, and it was having a very bad night. Heitmann had been detected and forced underwater by Allied aircraft earlier in the day. Now the destroyers had found him and they were not letting go. HMS Petard, along with several other escorts, held the contact and ran attack after attack with depth charges. For over 10 hours they pounded the submarine, driving it deeper, then shallower, forcing it to maneuver, draining its battery and its air. By nightfall, U-559 was finished. Heitmann ordered her surfaced and abandoned. As the German crew came up through the hatch and into the water, Petard came alongside. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Mark Thornton, immediately ordered a boarding party. What followed was one of the most remarkable and costly acts of the entire Enigma capture story. Petty Officer Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier stripped off their gear and swam to the submarine in the dark. They did not wait for a boat. They climbed up the side of the sinking vessel and went below. Lieutenant Tommy Brown, a canteen assistant who was only 16 years old and had falsified his age to enlist, went with them. Inside the submarine, with water already beginning to pour in, Fasson and Grazier searched the radio room. They found an Enigma machine. They found documents. They began passing materials up through the hatch to Brown, who relayed them into the waiting whaler alongside. They passed up a short signal book. They passed up weather documents. They passed up keying materials that would prove crucial to the four-rotor analysis back at Bletchley Park. And then U-559 went down. She sank so fast that Tommy Brown, the 16-year-old, only just managed to get out in time. Fasten and Grazier did not make it. They went down with the submarine. Two men drowned in a sinking U-boat in the dark of the North Atlantic, holding Enigma materials in their hands. They were awarded the George Cross posthumously. Tommy Brown received the George Medal. He never talked about what had happened until long after the war. When he finally did, what he described was not heroism in any grand cinematic sense. It was two men deciding they had to go in and get whatever was down there and going in and not coming back. What they recovered proved to be decisive. The Kerr-Signalheft, the short signal book they retrieved, along with other keying materials, gave Bletchley Park exactly the foothold they needed for the four-rotor system. Within weeks, analysts were reading four-rotor naval Enigma traffic again. The blackout ended. The convoys could be routed. The wolf packs found themselves hunting emptiness again. Slowly, the balance of the Atlantic campaign began to shift back in favor of the Allies. It would take until mid-1943 for the shift to become permanent, for U-boat losses to reach a level that the German Navy could no longer sustain, for the wolf packs to be effectively broken as a strategic threat. But the process that led there, the intelligence advantage that made it possible, runs directly through that dark night in the North Atlantic, and through the two men who swam to a sinking submarine and did not come back. What happened at Bletchley Park once these physical captures began delivering usable material is its own remarkable story, and it cannot be separated from the larger Enigma narrative. Because capturing a machine and its keys was only the beginning. What you did with that material once you had it was the difference between a one-time intelligence windfall and a sustained, systematic advantage that could actually change the direction of the war. The code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park had grown by 1942 from a small, eccentric collection of academics and puzzle enthusiasts to a genuine industrial-scale intelligence enterprise employing thousands of people. The estate at Bletchley, known to its inhabitants as BP and to the outside world as Station X, was an unlikely setting for what was arguably the most consequential intellectual operation in human history. The main house, a Victorian Gothic pile of red brick and turrets, was surrounded by huts, prefabricated wooden structures thrown up quickly to house the expanding workforce. Hut 3 was where German Air Force and Army signals were translated and analyzed. Hut 6 handled the actual code-breaking of those signals. Hut 8 was Alan Turing's domain, focused specifically on naval Enigma. Each hut had its own culture, its own hierarchies, its own ways of working. Alan Turing himself is the figure history most associates with Bletchley Park, and the association is deserved but incomplete. Turing's contribution was foundational in the deepest sense. He had worked before the war on the theoretical basis for a machine that could test possible Enigma settings mechanically, an improvement on work that Polish mathematicians had already begun before the war made Poland inaccessible. The Poles, specifically a team working at a facility outside Warsaw that included Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosiecki and Henryk Zygalski, had already cracked earlier, simpler versions of Enigma in the 1930s, and had developed techniques in a primitive mechanical device which they called the bomba, to assist in breaking daily settings. When Poland fell in September 1939, Polish intelligence made one of the most significant decisions of the war. They shared everything they had with the British and the French. The Poles passed on their reconstructed Enigma machines, their mathematical analyses, their bomba designs, and their years of experience breaking German codes. This gift of knowledge gave the British a massive head start. It meant Bletchley Park did not have to begin from zero. They could stand on the shoulders of what the Polish mathematicians had already done. Turing took what the Poles had provided and extended it. He developed a more powerful version of the bomb machine, an electromechanical device roughly 6 feet wide and 6 feet tall, covered in rotating drums that represented Enigma rotors and connected in configurations designed to test thousands of possible rotor settings very quickly. The bomb did not work by brute force alone. It worked by logic, by identifying contradictions in potential settings that could be used to eliminate whole ranges of possibilities, and zero in on the correct configuration much more quickly than pure exhaustive testing would allow. Gordon Welchman added a critical improvement called the diagonal board, which dramatically increased the bomb's efficiency. By mid-1941, there were multiple bombs running at Bletchley Park, and by the end of the war there were over 200. Each one humming, clicking, stepping through rotor configurations looking for a valid decrypt. The combination of physical captures from the Atlantic and the analytical power of the bombs created a feedback loop. Physical captures provided correct settings that analysts could use to verify and refine their methods. Those refined methods allowed the bombs to work more efficiently. Better bomb efficiency meant faster breaks, which meant more intelligence in less time. Which meant more convoy diversions, more accurate assessments of German operational plans, more lives saved. The intelligence produced by breaking Enigma was given the codename Ultra, and it is difficult to overstate how sensitive the handling of ultra-intelligence was throughout the war. The secrecy was not just about keeping the Germans from knowing their code was broken. It was about keeping everyone from knowing. Allied commanders who received intelligence derived from Ultra were told it came from a highly reliable human agent. They were never told it came from broken codes. This was deliberate. Because if even a single person who knew the true source of the intelligence was captured and talked, the entire system would collapse. The Germans would change Enigma immediately. The advantage would evaporate. Everything that had been built at such cost, the captures, the analysis, the bomb machines, the thousands of hours of human labor, would be worthless overnight. So Ultra was protected with a ferocity that sometimes caused operational difficulties. There were occasions when Allied commanders, knowing from Ultra that a German convoy was sailing a particular route, or that a U-boat wolf pack was positioned at a specific location, could not act on that knowledge directly without risking revealing that the intelligence came from something other than normal reconnaissance. In those situations, they would send out a reconnaissance aircraft first, to create a plausible alternative explanation for how the convoy or the U-boat had been detected. The subterfuge added layers of complexity, but it was necessary. The source had to be protected above all else. The strategic impact of ultra-intelligence across the whole war is almost impossible to fully quantify because so much of it worked through absence rather than presence. Ships that did not sink, supply convoys that arrived intact, military operations that failed because they had been anticipated. The absence of disaster is hard to measure. But historians who have been able to study the declassified Ultra records since they began to be released in the 1970s have consistently concluded that Enigma intelligence shortened the war significantly. Some estimates suggest by 2 to 4 years, others go further. What is clear is that without the intelligence produced by Bletchley Park, without the physical captures that made that intelligence possible, the Battle of the Atlantic would almost certainly have been lost, and with it, the ability to sustain Britain as a base for the eventual liberation of Western Europe. The North African campaign offers another example of Ultra's direct impact. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was one of the most tactically brilliant commanders of the war. He consistently outmaneuvered Allied forces in the desert, reading their positions, anticipating their moves, striking where he was not expected. What he did not know was that his own communications were being read just as thoroughly as the Allied commanders were reading maps. Ultra gave the British command in North Africa a detailed picture of Rommel's logistics, his fuel supplies, his ammunition levels, his planned movements. When Rommel was at the gates of Egypt in the summer of 1942, appearing to be on the edge of a breakthrough that could have handed Germany control of the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil fields, it was partly Ultra intelligence that allowed General Bernard Montgomery to position his forces correctly at El Alamein and defeat him. Rommel himself, after the war, remarked that it had seemed as if the British always knew exactly what he was going to do before he did it. He was not far wrong. In the Mediterranean, Ultra tracked Italian and German naval movements with enough precision to allow the Royal Navy to interdict supply convoys between Italy and North Africa. Rommel's armies in the desert needed fuel, food, and ammunition shipped across the Mediterranean. Ultra helped identify those convoys, and Allied submarines and aircraft helped sink them. The progressive strangulation of Rommel's supply lines, which played a decisive role in the eventual Allied victory in North Africa, was substantially powered by Enigma intelligence. In Greece, in the Balkans, in the planning for the Allied invasions of Sicily and mainland Italy, Ultra provided a layer of intelligence that conventional reconnaissance could not match. And then came 1944, the greatest military operation in Western history. The planning for D-Day, the Allied invasion of occupied France, was the most complex and consequential military undertaking ever attempted. Its success depended on complete strategic surprise, on convincing the Germans that the invasion would come somewhere other than where it actually came. The deception operation, known as Operation Bodyguard, was a masterwork of misdirection involving fake armies, false radio traffic, double agents, and an elaborate fiction designed to convince Hitler and the German high command that the real invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais, not at Normandy. Ultra was central to this deception. Because Bletchley Park was reading the communications of the German high command, they could see in real time whether the deception was working. They could see which German units were being positioned where. They could see what Hitler's commanders believed about Allied intentions. They could adjust the deception operation based on what was actually being communicated inside the German command structure. When the landings at Normandy began on June 6, 1944, Ultra intelligence had given the Allied planners a detailed picture of German defensive dispositions. They knew where the armored reserves were positioned. They knew which commanders were assigned to which sectors. They knew the German order of battle in France down to divisional level. This intelligence did not make the landings easy. The fighting on the beaches and the hedgerows of Normandy was brutal and the casualties were severe. But it gave the planners the ability to make decisions based on something closer to complete information than any commander in the history of warfare had ever possessed. And when the German High Command, still convinced the Normandy landings were a feint, held back its armored reserves for days waiting for the real invasion at Calais, Ultra allowed the Allies to confirm in real time that the deception was still working, that the panzers were staying put, that the beachhead had the time it needed to consolidate before the real armored counterattack came. The German commanders at Normandy were fighting blind, issuing orders based on incomplete information, making assessments that were systematically wrong because their intelligence had been compromised at its root. And they did not know it. They could not know it. Enigma was supposed to be unbreakable. The possibility that it had been broken, that every order sent on an Enigma machine might be read by the enemy within hours, was simply not a hypothesis that the German military command had allowed itself to seriously entertain, even when certain operations went consistently wrong. Even when the Allies seemed consistently well prepared, the German response was almost always to blame treachery, bad luck, or the competence of the enemy, never to question the security of their communications. There were a few German officers who worried, who raised questions, who suggested that perhaps Enigma had been compromised. Those voices were systematically dismissed. The mathematics said it was impossible. The mathematics was wrong, not because the mathematics was flawed, but because it had not accounted for the human ingenuity, the desperate courage, and the cold water of the North Atlantic that had allowed physical machines and their keys to fall into enemy hands. The failure to even consider the possibility of compromise was one of the great intelligence failures of the war. It was not stupidity, it was the trap of absolute confidence. When you have done the mathematics and the mathematics tells you something is impossible, it is very difficult to maintain the intellectual humility to keep asking whether the mathematics has missed something. The German military had built Enigma. They understood it completely. They had run the numbers. And they simply could not bring themselves to believe that a combination of physical seizure, Polish mathematics, British engineering, and the particular genius of a group of eccentric academics in a country house in Buckinghamshire had together succeeded in doing what the numbers said could not be done. The people who captured Enigma material in the Atlantic paid prices for it that the history books record too briefly. Anthony Fasson and Colin Grazier, who swam to U-559 and did not come back, were real men with real families. Fasson was 29 years old. Grazier was 22. Tommy Brown, the teenager who barely escaped, went on to survive the war but died in 1945 in a house fire trying to save his younger sister. He was only 18 years old. David Bomme, who led the boarding party on U-110, lived until 2016 and spent decades unable to speak about what he had done. He gave his first detailed public interview only in his 80s after the full story had been declassified. When he did speak, what struck observers was not pride or a sense of drama, but a kind of quiet wonder at how the whole thing had actually worked. That a young man in a rowboat in the North Atlantic could reach into a sinking German submarine and pull out something that would change the course of a world war. It did not feel heroic in the moment, he said. It felt desperate, improvised, frightening. The heroism was something other people decided on later. The Germans, for their part, did conduct inquiries after the war into whether Enigma had been compromised. They reached various conclusions at various times, most of them wrong. Some German analysts concluded that the Allies had made extraordinary advances in cryptanalysis but had no idea how far those advances had gone. Others suggested the compromise had come from human intelligence, from agents inside the German military, from captured personnel who had talked. The actual truth, that physical captures of Enigma machines and their key materials had been the essential bridge between the theoretical work at Bletchley Park and the practical ability to read operational German communications, was not fully understood even by those doing the investigating. The captures had been so well concealed, the secrecy so absolute that even retrospective inquiry could not fully reconstruct what had happened. The captured crews had been isolated. The ships had sunk. The documents had vanished into British intelligence files, so secret they would not see daylight for 30 years. The full story began to emerge in 1974 when Frederick Winterbotham, a former British intelligence officer who had been involved in distributing ultra-intelligence to field commanders, published a book called The Ultra Secret. It was the first time the public had any real inkling of what had been accomplished at Bletchley Park. The reaction was a kind of stunned disbelief. Historians who had been writing about the Second World War for decades suddenly had to reconsider whole sections of their analysis. Military decisions that had seemed inexplicably prescient or bafflingly poor now made sudden new sense in the light of what one side had known and the other had not. The subsequent decades brought more declassification, more memoirs, more detailed historical work, and the gradual construction of the full picture that historians now have access to. What that picture shows is a war within the war, fought not in the open but in radio frequencies, in the rotation of electrical contacts through a scrambling device, in the scratch of pencils on decode sheets in a converted stable block in Buckinghamshire. A war where the weapons were mathematical intuition and physical courage, and the willingness of young men to swim to sinking submarines in the dark. A war where the casualties were real, where Fasten and Grazier proved with their lives that the intelligence war was not a bloodless shadow of the real conflict but a part of it, as costly and as vital as any battle fought on land or sea. The strategic picture that Ultra produced across the whole war has been analyzed extensively, and the consensus among historians is that its contribution was unique in military history, not just because of the intelligence it produced but because of the sustained, systematic nature of that intelligence. Many wars have featured intelligence coups, captured documents, turned agents, intercepted communications, but Ultra was different. It was not a single breakthrough. It was a continuous, ongoing process that lasted for years and touched virtually every theater of the war. North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Eastern Front to a lesser degree, the planning for D-Day, the pursuit of Germany across France and into the Reich itself. At every stage, Bletchley Park was reading German communications. Not perfectly, not always, not without gaps and failures and periods of blackout, but consistently enough, comprehensively enough, to give Allied commanders an advantage that their German counterparts simply could not match. The Germans had their own codebreakers, their own intelligence services. Some of them were extremely capable, but they were not breaking Allied high-level communications with anything like the consistency and depth that Bletchley Park was achieving against German Enigma traffic. The asymmetry in cryptographic intelligence between the two sides was one of the defining structural advantages of the Allied war effort, and it was not primarily the result of superior technology or superior mathematics. It was the result of physical captures, of sailors who went aboard damaged and sinking German ships and took what they found there, of a 16-year-old boy passing documents through a hatch while water poured in around him, of a boarding party rowing through the North Atlantic in a wooden whaler toward a submarine that might sink under them or blow up in their faces. The technology mattered. Turing's bombed machines mattered. The brilliant analysts of Hut 8 mattered enormously, but none of it worked without the physical